Welcome to Chapter 6. In this chapter of world history, we're going to be looking at the Byzantine Empire. We're also going to be looking at the Slavic civilization. We'll be looking at the beginning of the Islamic Caliphates and the Islamic faith. We'll also be looking at the Roman Catholic Church as well as its interaction with and relationship to the Byzantine or Orthodox Church. So let's look at our study here. The Byzantine Empire. Let's do a quick recap. Where we ended chapter 5, we had a divided Roman Empire, west and east. If you remember, Diocletian had divided it and formed a tetrarchy. Eventually, the West is going to collapse. We're going to have a series of events, starting with the Visigoth sacking of Rome in 410 AD. We're going to see the attacking or the invading of Attila the Hun into northern Italy in 452. And of course, we talked about Pope Leo I, who was going to negotiate with Attila to spare Rome. That's in 452. But finally, Odoacer is going to force the abdication of the final Roman Caesar, Romulus Augustus, in 476 AD. Of course, this is the culmination of a whole lot of different tribes from the east and north, European tribes that are migrating from the northern Baltic area and from Eastern Europe. They're going to move across Europe. We've got the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons moving into Brittany, the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Visigoths, the Goths, the Ostrogoths. We got all kinds of tribes that are migrating and causing all kinds of pressure on the Western Roman Empire. Again, as we said, ending up with the final collapse of Rome in the West in 476 AD. Now, when the dust settles, this is what Europe looks like. We've got the Western Roman Empire gone, and in its place we have a variety of different tribes that have taken over. You can see the Ostrogoths have a great deal of Italy and southern Eastern Europe. You've got the Franks who were taking over Central Europe. The Burgundians, I should say, what we would call southern France, modern day France. You've got the Visigoths taking eastern France, much of Spain, and of course you can see the Huns have much of the Slavic territory, modern-day Russia and Eastern Europe. And then up north in Britain, you see the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Eventually, this will become, of course, the land of the Angles, otherwise known as Angleland or England. And then, of course, you see in the east, we have the continuing Eastern Roman Empire. But from this point forward here, historians refer to this as the Byzantine Empire. We'll look more at the nomenclature here in just a few minutes. By 500 AD, the Hunnic Empire has collapsed, and again, we have just a bunch of different tribes who have taken over the West. I do want you to notice we have added here to the map the competing empire in the east is the Persian Empire, the current Sassanid or Sassanian Empire, that is going to demand much of the attention of the Byzantines throughout the next several hundred years. Now, I want to zoom in on the map here. You see Constantinople there on the map. We're going to zoom into that area. There you go. And you can see a couple of geographic features I want you to notice. Constantinople is at a spot that basically connects Europe to the Asiatic continental landmass. It's separated by a very thin strip of water known as the Bosphorus Strait. The Bosphorus Strait is what leads into the Black Sea, and then as you come out of the Bosphorus Strait, eventually you'll go into the Aegean Sea. We've been familiar with the Aegean Sea with our study of Greek civilization, but you see the Dardanelles Strait, another very narrow strip of water that separates Asia Minor from the European landmass, and in between them, in between the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles, is the Sea of Marmara. And that is a small little body of water, and it is there that we have Constantinople. And that's a very important land bridge, essentially, that connects Asia to Europe. And so this is going to make Constantinople incredibly important and wealthy and significant economically, militarily, politically, culturally, etc. Now, let's take a look at, there we go, the Eastern Roman Empire. we also now are going to call it, as I said, the Byzantine Empire. Officially, people have different opinions as when you start it. Some people start it when Constantine moved the capital and renamed the capital. It used to be Byzantium, and it was renamed. He actually renamed it New Rome, but eventually it became known as the city of Constantine, and eventually that morphed into Constantinople. And so some will date the beginning of the Byzantine Empire in 330 AD. Others, however, will begin this period of history with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476. All pretty much agree that this comes to a conclusion about 1,000 years later in 1453 AD with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So that's roughly 1,000-year time period of history. Now, as we mentioned before, the Byzantine Empire is going to control the land and sea crossroads between Asia and Europe and be very, very significant. It's going to, of course, as I said, be one of the most important and wealthiest cities in the world. And, of course, it will be important politically, religiously, and commercially. Now, let's talk about the identity of the Byzantine Empire. Is it Roman? Is it Greek? Now, this is in the East, where traditionally it's been very Greek. This is basically the heart of what has been the Greek civilization, or part of the heart of Greek civilization. In many ways, the Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire. It had the same legal and political structures. It had the same customs, same traditions. And so the question is this new or old? Is this a new empire, or is this just a former Roman Empire? The Byzantines referred to themselves as Roman. If you could get into a time-traveling DeLorean and travel back to the time of the Byzantine Empire, and you asked them about being a Byzantine, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They referred to themselves as Roman. They very much were the continuation of the Roman Empire. They didn't see themselves any separate or different or distinct from what we call the Western Roman Empire. And so they very much saw themselves as Roman. However, they were very Greek in their culture and their ideology, more East than West, and actually in some ways more Asiatic than European. So when you look at the Byzantine Empire, it's quite fascinating because it's, in the one sense, there's a newness to it, but it's actually steeped in old traditional Roman values. There's a lot of Greekness to it, but they certainly saw themselves and identified as Roman and continued Roman traditions. And so there's definitely more, or some East mixed with West. And so it's sort of a melting pot of new and old, Greek and Roman, East and West, Asian and European in very many ways. So scholars have fun talking about this in different circles. Now, let's jump into the probably most important Byzantine emperor that you're going to need to be familiar with, and this is Justinian. This is a famous mosaic of him. No, those are not earrings. At least I don't think they are. But no, that's a dude, not a woman. For a long time when I was younger, I thought that was a lady, but no, that's a guy. He was emperor in the 6th century between 527 and 565. And he is, as I said, the most significant or influential Byzantine Empire. He desired to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory, and he's going to do much to recover the different Roman territories, North Africa, much of Italy, Thrace, Dalmatia. He's going to recover much of that, Sicily, etc. And one of the things he's most famous for is the Justinian law code. He decided that they needed to preserve the Roman law codes. That was, as you can imagine, 1,000 years of Roman history throughout the Roman Republic and the first 500 years of the Roman Empire, or the 500 years of the Western Roman Empire. They had a lot of laws on the books, and some were competing and contradictory to one another. It was actually quite chaotic. And Justinian decided that he was going to have 10 men compile, reorganize, and condense Roman law. And his work is basically the basis for much of the Western world's law codes. And we owe a great deal of debt to Justinian for preserving these Roman law and legal codes. Now, when we look at the map, by 550 AD, this is what the Byzantine Empire looked like. As I mentioned before, he's recovered North Africa from the Vandals. He's got Egypt and the Syrian, Judean, Palestinian land along the eastern part of the Mediterranean. He's got all the former Greek territories, all of Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, basically all of the islands, or most of the islands in the western Mediterranean. And so he's recovered quite a bit of the former territories. So what else does he do? Well, he's going to have an extensive building campaign. And one of the things he's most famous for is the building of a church called the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. He's also going to build public buildings, aqueducts, bathhouses, roads. He's going to patronize the Byzantine arts. So he's going to do quite a bit to further and expand Roman culture and Roman status and prestige in the East here. But his military campaigns, his building programs are going to financially bankrupt the Byzantine Empire. Now here's a picture, or a drawing I should say, of the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. It was an amazing edifice, amazing building. It basically combined the architectural motifs of the state and the church. It merged the dome with the rectangular state kind of building, the dome of the church, and he merged these two. And by the way, I'm gonna have you guys watch a video on the significance of the building of the Church of Hagia Sophia. It's a pretty amazing architectural feat of an engineering marvel. And here's a cross section of the church. You can see the inside of it here. It's quite beautiful. And of course, it still stands today. It's in modern day Istanbul, Turkey. It's now a mosque. It's no longer called the Church of Hagia Sophia. Now, let's talk about the Byzantine and Roman Catholic Church. Well, how was this organized? Well, the church was organized basically by 5 patriarchates, or 5 patriarchs of the church. These were the heads, and those names just ran right past you. But I'll show them here to you on the map, and we'll run right through these. Let me say that all 5 of the patriarchs from these territories, it was Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, they all share equal status and authority. All 5 accepted the Nicene Creed, which united them in doctrine and basic theology. In the map, here's where they're located. Of course, Rome, you know where they're right there in the middle of Italy. You've got Constantinople, there's one of the patriarchs. Over there in the east, you've got Antioch, and then Jerusalem, and then Alexandria in Egypt. Now, of course, Jerusalem, we understand why the bishop there was very important. The patriarch was very important there. It's the center of the Christian faith, where Jesus' ministry, much of his ministry took place, and of course his crucifixion and resurrection. Antioch, if you look in the book of Acts, was a very significant place for the early Christian church. It's the place where Paul sort of centered his missionary home base as he went on his activities in the Asia Minor. It's also, according to Acts, the place that Christians were first called Christians. They originally called members of the way, or the followers of Jesus, but they became known as Christians in Antioch. So early on, that location was very important to the Christian church. Alexandria had a huge Jewish population, and many Christians, many became Christians in the ensuing couple of centuries. So all 3 of those were very important in the East. Rome, of course, became important after the gospel spread west, and of course now Constantinople. Now, let's talk a little bit about the rise and fall of the church. We spoke a little bit at that chapter 5 about this, but let's kind of refresh our memories. Why did we have a rising and the falling of the church? Well, if you remember initially, the church underwent quite a bit of persecution. Initially, it was local persecution or sort of sporadic imperial persecution. We see Nero in the 60s persecuting the Christians locally. We see many examples of local Jewish or Roman officials in different places throughout the empire persecuting Christians because it was basically bad for business. They were causing a little bit of uproar. And so we have that kind of persecution. Later on, persecution becomes empire-wide and state-sponsored. And we certainly see this with Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century AD. And here's some, we forgot to change the animation there. But here's some graphics here, some famous paintings of Christians. They were used as part of gladiatorial games, as entertainment, as they were fed to animals. They had to fight them or fight each other. Here we see a couple of mosaics of animals basically tearing into Christians. They were used as they were burned. Nero actually used them as nightlights to light up his way, his streets and parties. So this all changed, though, however, with the support of Christianity by Constantine and some of his successor emperors. Constantine became a supporter of Christianity, converted to Christianity, or at least expressed a faith in Christ. Whether that was accurate or not, I don't know, but at least verbalized that he was a Christian. And Theodosius, one of the following emperors at the end of the 4th century, will actually make Christianity the official state-sponsored religion. So it's going to enjoy quite a bit of support with Constantine and many emperors. And so persecution is going to go away. However, Constantine is going to set the precedent for state involvement in the affairs of the church. He's going to be involved in the Arian controversy. He's going to call for the Church of Council of Nicaea, Council of Nicaea in 325 to decide the issue on Arianism. And he's just generally going to become very involved in the affairs of the church. And as I mentioned, Theodosius I is going to make Christianity the state religion. Now, here's the problem. This is going to set the stage for the corruption and disruption of the church. Well, one of the reasons, if you remember our conversation, is that many people are going to convert to Christianity for either political or financial gain. To be appointed to an office, it would be helpful if you were like-minded with the emperor who professed Christianity. And so people would nominally say they were Christians in order to attain these positions and further their own status, political standing, or line their own pockets. So that's not a good thing. On top of that, the state is going to begin to influence appointments of church leaders and therefore impacting church theology. The result of these is going to be that some church officials are not even going to be Christian. And then finally, this is going to lead to some very non-biblical theology entering the church. So this is leading, that we saw the rise of the church, but this is eventually going to contribute to the corruption, disruption, and the fall of the church. There we go. All right, so what are some of these differences or corruptions? Well, here are a couple of departures from the practice and theology of Jesus in the early New Testament church. Number one, church tradition and Scripture are going to be considered equal authority. Previously, Scripture was the sole authority. But as we move into this era, now church tradition and what church leaders say is going to have equal authority of the Bible. Secondly, baptism is going to be equivalent to salvation. In other words, if you're baptized, you become born again. It's not really a matter of faith. When the Bible talks about, Jesus talks about, Paul talks about to believe, one is born again, to believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, to believe in his sacrificial death, his resurrection on our behalf. It's in those things that we had salvation, but now baptism, the act of baptism, is going to supposedly give status of being born again or salvation. We're going to see that salvation is going to occur through different sacred works. We'll talk about the 7 sacraments of the church coming up soon in the next chapter or two. But right now, just know that salvation can be attained. It's a process by which you do certain things: baptism, communion, confession, going to Mass, and eventually last rites. Those things basically give you bits of God's grace. The church will teach that it's through the grace of Jesus that you're saved, but you acquire these by doing certain acts. And this is not taught in the New Testament or in the early church. We're going to see increased authority given to church leaders, bishops and popes, and they're going to have a level of authority that we do not see in the New Testament. So what is the difference between the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantine Orthodox Church? Well, let's look at, from a leadership or authority standpoint, what the differences are. So we start off here, we see the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, the Western is sort of collapsed here. This is signified by the There we go. There we got the Pope in the West, the Roman Emperor in the West. You've got the Patriarch in the East of the Orthodox Church and the Eastern Roman Empire. But of course, as we said, the Roman Empire collapses and we no longer have a emperor in the West. So the leading authority will become the church, and that's represented by the Pope. So his influence and status and prestige and power is going to be eclipsed by no one, essentially. He has a lot of authority. In the East, we're not going to see that at all. We're going to see actually where the emperor will have authority over the church, and that's going to be called Caesaropapism. This is the idea that the Caesar, or the emperor, is over the church, or over the Pope, the leader of the church. So in the East, the patriarch will never have the status, the Eastern Orthodox patriarch will never have the status of the Pope in the West. He will be under the authority of the emperor. In the West, the Pope does not have any emperor that he's under the authority of. Matter of fact, this is actually going to set up for the next several hundred years and throughout medieval history, where the Pope wants to exercise authority over all state governments. And we'll see this as problematic, and eventually the states and the different kings of different kingdoms will push back to some extent and eventually assert their influence and authority over the church itself. But so in the East, you see it completely different. The emperor is over the church. So what are some of the other differences between the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantine or Orthodox Church? Well, the first thing is, and some of these may seem inconsequential to us, but they're quite important to them. One is, what is the proper dates for celebrating Easter? Now, the Eastern Orthodox Church uses the Julian calendar, which has got about a 13-day difference from the Gregorian calendar used by the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church also uses the formula set up by the Nicene Council in 325 AD that basically states that Easter must occur after the Jewish Passover. And the Roman Catholic Church does it differently. As I said, they use the Gregorian calendar, but they also calculate Easter based off of the first Sunday after the first full moon after or on the March equinox. So bottom line is, I don't expect you to know all those details, but just know that they see differently when you should celebrate Easter, and it's quite important. Another difference is the idea of celibacy or marriage for priests. In the Roman Catholic Church, priests are essentially serving God alone and cannot engage in marital intimacy and get married. In the Byzantine Church, that is not so. The use of icons is going to be a distinction. We'll talk about that more later. An icon is simply a picture of a saint or a significant figure from church history, and they become quite important in many ways for both the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantine Church. But early on, it's going to be a very heavily contested point of contention. And next, we can see relationship to the state. We actually already looked at that. The Roman Catholic Church had no authority over him in the West, but in the East, the relationship between the state and the church was that the state was over the church. And again, we call that Caesaropapism. Another interesting difference is the use of leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist or the communion meal. The Roman Catholic Church uses unleavened bread. The Orthodox Church uses leavened bread. And for much of the first several hundred years, up through about the 7th century, all churches, or I should say most, the Armenian Church did not do this, but most used leavened bread. However, the Roman Catholic Church began to want to go back to what was it like for Jesus at the Passover meal. And Jesus, of course, was celebrating the Passover, which meant unleavened bread. The Byzantine Orthodox Church, however, says, unleavened bread is lifeless, and that represents lifelessness. Yeast or leavened bread is lifeful. It's full of life. It represents resurrection, and so they felt it more apropos to use leavened bread. Also, they kind of had a problem with Jewish folks wanting to sort of Judaize the Catholic or the Orthodox Church, and so they said, we want to make a distinction between Jewish Passover and the Christian communion meal, and so they have insisted that the Eucharist be with leavened bread. And then next we have the difference of the phrase, the Latin phrase, filioque, added to the Nicene Creed. The word filioque means "and the Son," and this was a phrase added by the Eastern Orthodox Church in order to strengthen the argument that Jesus had a divine nature. The Roman Catholic Church, however, thought that this undermined the authority of the Father in the Trinity, and so this became very contentious again amongst the Eastern and Western churches. And then finally, the authority of the Roman bishop over all the churches, including the Byzantine Church. The Roman bishop, or the Pope, is going to believe that he has authority over all the other patriarchs, over all the other churches, all the other bishops, and he has the ultimate authority. He is the Catholic Church. He's the leader of the Catholic or universal church. That's what Catholic means. And this is not going to play well with the other patriarchates, especially the Orthodox Church, and they see themselves as independent. They believe they're fully a part of the same body, that they are part of one faith, but they do not see themselves as subservient to the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope in the West. And then ultimately, this will lead to the Great Schism of 1054 AD that's basically going to result in the official splitting between the Eastern and Western churches. Now, today there is some relationship there, and there has been some mending of fences, but basically for 1,000 years of history, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church in the West have basically been separated in many ways. So this is our study of the Byzantine Empire and just kind of a summary of it, as well as a look at the Byzantine and Roman Catholic Church. Very quickly, we're going to look at the Slavic civilization, the Slavs. Well, who in the world are the Slavs? You probably don't even know who they are. Well, this is several tribes from the Eurasian mountains are going to move into Eastern Europe around the Balkans and the Danube River, as Germanic tribes are moving west, fleeing from the Huns. The Slavs are going to use numerous rivers and waterways to conduct trade and commerce with European states, but they will be greatly influenced by the Byzantine Empire. And this is the reason why we're kind of looking at them now, because the culture and traditions of the Slavs will be greatly impacted, influenced by the Byzantine Empire. Now, a group of people called the Norsemen, the Northmen. These are people from the north. We know them as the Vikings. They're going to come from the Scandinavian territories to the north, and they're going to use these different waterways that we just mentioned and migrate from the Baltic coasts near Norway and Sweden and Finland, and they're going to migrate down into the same area that these Slavs are. Basically, it's just north of the borders of the Byzantine Empire, just north of the Danube River. We'll look at a map here in a minute. These Norsemen or Vikings, as you remember from probably different movies or books you've read, they're very warlike, and they're going to dominate these Slavic cities. Now, eventually, these Norse are going to get absorbed into the Slavic population. What's interesting is that the name Russian likely comes from the Slavic word used to describe these Norsemen, Rus, which means rowers or seafarers. And so this term Rus or Russian is basically who the Slavs are going to become, modern-day Russians. And it's sort of a holdover from the Norsemen who migrated into the Slavic territories and merged with the Slavic people. And this will be their principal identity today, is the Russians. Now, one very important city is Kiev. It's going to be one of many Slavic cities, but this will become the center for Slavic political and commercial power. Now, the Slavs were heavily influenced by Byzantine culture via commercial, political, and Russian religious contacts. There's actually going to be a development of their own alphabet from Byzantine missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, which we'll be looking at them in just a minute. And they're going to develop a law code from the Byzantine law code. They're going to derive it directly from there. And they're going to combine this with local Slavic tribal law. Eastern Orthodoxy will become the official state religion, as paganism will become outlawed. And then their artwork, icons, architecture are going to mimic Byzantine styles. They're even going to build their own Hagia Sophia Cathedral to imitate that with building that Hagia Sophia, I can't talk, in Constantinople. An interesting contribution they're going to make to the architecture of these. You've probably seen pictures of these, but this is the onion dome, and we'll see some images here in just a minute. It's going to be a very unique contribution to the Eastern Orthodox Church construction. Now, here's a picture of the Cyrillic alphabet. It's named after the two brothers, one of them, Cyril and Methodius. These are Byzantine missionaries who are going to travel into the Slavic territories, and they will basically use Greek. If you know some Greek, you'll see that these are actually very similar to the Greek alphabet, but they're going to use the Slavic language to develop this, and this is called the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, they're also going to develop their own Slavic icons. This is a picture of a Slavic icon, very, very popular in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and we'll look at more pictures of these as we study in class. And here are the Slavic churches, and very just beautiful architecture. I just can't even imagine. It's just so beautiful. Here's the onion domes that they're going to add as a significant contribution and modification to the Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox Church style, but they're just absolutely beautiful. Now, one character I'm going to want you to know, you have to at least know one character, some important figure. His name is Yaroslav the Wise. He's going to rule Kiev from 1036 until 1054 AD. He's basically going to arrange political marriages between his family and those of the great European powers like France and Sweden, Norway, Poland, Hungary, and the Byzantine Empire. He's going to expand the Slavic territory and create a federation of Slavic cities. He really wants his kingdom to rival that of the Byzantines, and he's going to sponsor great building and construction programs, libraries, churches, schools, monasteries, fortifications. He's going to be a sponsor of Slavic and Orthodox art. He's going to bring in Byzantine painters, artists, architects, teachers, and priests from the Byzantine Empire to build his culture and his empire. So he's a very important figure in Slavic history. Now, Kiev is going to lose much of its significance after the death of Yaroslav, and other Slavic cities are going to vie for power and influence. Eventually, Kiev's influence is going to be nullified after the invasion of the Tartars. These are the Mongols from Eastern Asia in 1240, and they are basically going to be controlled by the Mongols up until the late 1400s, so the next couple hundred years. After the Tartars are driven out, a new Russian Slavic city would become the center of Russia. We know it as Moscow, and there are the Tartars, the Mongols, who controlled Russia for about 200 years. So Russia will become the center of the Slavic people. Today, of course, we know Moscow. It's an incredibly important political, commercial center in Russia. So that does it for our study of the Byzantine Empire and the Slavic civilization. We'll be talking a lot more about more details in class. Okay, now that we've looked at what the Byzantine Empire was facing to its west in Europe and to its north in northeast Europe in the form of the Slavic civilization, let's turn our attention to the east and see what the Byzantine civilization was encountering on its eastern and southern borders. There's going to be a new people group, a new civilization. I say new, it's really not new. People had been living in the Arabian Peninsula for thousands of years. In Rome, during the time of the Roman Empire, they called it the Nabatean Kingdom. But as we move into the 7th century, we're going to have a new group, a new civilization. I guess I don't know the best way to say it here, but it's the Islamic Caliphates, or the Islamic state being governed by the Islamic faith. So let's take a look and see how this developed. The Byzantines had fought, as we mentioned, different Germanic tribes in the west. They had fought Vandals and Visigoths and Ostrogoths. They had encountered all of those. They had also encountered the Central Asiatic groups known as the Mongols. They had come in and had attacked from the north. And they had actually also encountered to the east the Sassanid or Persian Empire in the Anatolian region, Syria, along the Palestinian and Israel or Judean state. They had encountered them in that area. But a new threat is going to emerge to the Byzantine Empire from the southeast. This is in the Arabian Peninsula. Arabian warriors under the leadership of a religious prophet by the name of Muhammad. Now we can look at this map here. This is the Arabian Peninsula. You'll recognize at the top left corner of that map, that's the very eastern portion of the Mediterranean Sea. You can see the island of Cyprus in the middle of the water there. You should see just below that, you can see the Nile River. That's Egypt. The Red Sea, which connects the Mediterranean essentially almost to the Arabian Sea. To the north of the Arabian Peninsula, you see the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's our Mesopotamian territory that we have spoken about earlier when we talked about the earliest civilizations, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and of course the Persians. So this is all Persian territory to the north. And in the middle of all of this here is the Arabian Peninsula. It is essentially a great vast desert. The topography, the climate, this is essentially desert. Now there's a lot of civilizations along, as you can imagine, along the waterways, along the Persian Gulf, along the Red Sea, and along the Arabian Sea coastline. In between these cities, of course, is vast deserts inhabited by nomadic Bedouin tribes. And it is from this area that we're going to see the emergence of the Islamic faith. You can see here the bullet point, Arabian tribes are going to unify under the influence of a caravan trader turned prophet who will begin this new faith called Islam. And this individual, of course, most folks know, his name is Muhammad. He lived from 565 to 632 AD. So if you think about, we spoke about the Byzantine Empire, and the greatest Byzantine emperor was Justinian, and he died in 565, and or close to it. So just after the death of Justinian, Muhammad will be born. He will be born among the many tribal Bedouins, the nomads of the Arabian Peninsula. He'll be orphaned at the age of 6. He'll be raised by his uncle and his grandfather, and he will grow up in and around Mecca, a coastal city in the Arabian Peninsula. The tribes of Arabia are polytheistic. Mecca is going to have a significant temple, one of the most important temples that houses shrines to all of their gods. The name of this structure is called the Kaaba, and they will sacrifice and pay homage to their various deities. Muhammad is going to travel as he grows up with his uncle in his camel caravans, and he will travel great distances visiting into Jerusalem and Damascus, the Syrian territory of Damascus. He will travel into Persian territories. He will come in contact with 3 significant monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, which is essentially a Persian religion. But all of these are monotheistic, which is very different from the tribal polytheism that he is used to. And eventually, he's going to become rather disgusted with the polytheism of his own people, and he's going to set out to change this. Now, what Muhammad is going to claim is that he's going to receive the Quran from the angel Gabriel sometime between 609 and 632 AD. It's going to be an ongoing process. It's not a one-time deal. But over the course of these some odd 22 years or so, he will be meditating. This is how it starts out. He's meditating in a cave, and the angel Gabriel is going to appear to him and reveal the word of God. That is basically a corruption of the corrupt teachings of his own tribes, but also the corrupt teachings of Judaism and Christianity, which he believes has gone astray. And he's going to bring monotheism and the worship of the one true God to the world. Now, this is, again, what Muhammad believes, and it's what he will teach his followers. This, of course, is contrary to what we as Christians would claim to be truth, but I'm just sharing with you what Islam teaches as the origins of their faith. His belief system is going to be called Islam, which means submission to the will of Allah. And the people who submit to Allah are called Muslims, and these will be the followers of Muhammad. Now, here's a few of their chief beliefs. These are very important beliefs in Islam. The first and primary one is that Allah is one. There is no polytheism, and which is contrary to what his tribes, his native tribes believed, but it's also contrary to the Trinity understanding of the Christian faith, which believes in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, which are all three God, one essence, but three individual persons. So there's the Trinity, and then there was polytheism. Islam essentially rejects both of these. Christians will say one God, but in three persons. Islam, Muhammad will reject that concept. Muhammad is, here's another distinction or belief of Islam, that Muhammad is the final and highest prophet. They believe there were lots of prophets. Abraham, Moses, Elijah, they even believe Jesus of Nazareth was a prophet, but Muhammad is the final and highest prophet according to Islam. Now, the Quran is, which literally means recitations, is God's revealed word according to Islam. This is God's divine word to his people. Now, Islam has other secondary authoritative texts. Primarily, the main one is called the Hadith, which is the teachings of Muhammad. So this doesn't come from God necessarily, but this is sort of a chronicle of the teachings of Muhammad, and it carries significant weight in their authoritative weight in their faith. Now, they also consider the Bible authoritative, but unfortunately, they believe that Christians and Jews have corrupted the text of the Old and New Testaments, and therefore really can't be all that certain. They believe that you should follow much of it as that has been corrupted by the Jews and by the Christians. But they do consider an authoritative text to a point, unless it disagrees with the Quran or the Hadith. Now, Muhammad is going to spend the next, 12, 13 years teaching and preaching his revelations. And he's actually not going to have a lot of success. He will have a handful of converts initially, basically family and friends who will adopt this new belief system. Now, a significant event is going to happen in 621 AD. This is very significant in the Islamic faith. According to them, Muhammad was taken on a miraculous journey. Now, it wasn't just a vision. They believe he bodily was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem. And then from there, he was escorted into heaven. He was taken on a winged horse called a Buraq. And he was taken, as they say, to the furthest mosque, which is, they consider the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which incidentally wasn't actually built until 705 AD. And this trip happened in 621 AD. So that's almost 100 years later before this mosque was actually built. But they believe that he was taken to this mosque, and this journey, which is again two parts, first to Jerusalem, Isra, and then from there to heaven, the Mirash. And so he will from there ascend into heaven. While he's in heaven, he's going to meet with various prophets like Adam, Moses, Jesus, Aaron, Abraham. And eventually he will go on to meet with God. And God is going to give him various instructions, including a significant one, which is that the followers of Islam were to pray 50 times per day, 50. Now, Moses is actually going to tell him to go back and renegotiate, saying that's too many prayers, that's too much praying each day. And eventually he will negotiate with God down to 5 times a day. Now, the entire trip to Jerusalem, which, by the way, normally would take a month to travel to Jerusalem from Mecca, this trip to Jerusalem and the ascension to heaven will take place overnight. So it's just one night. And that's why it's called the miraculous journey. And it becomes a very important event. About a year later, in September of 622 AD, Muhammad, who has not incurred a great deal of favor with many people in Mecca, because he's basically preaching get rid of the gods, the polytheistic gods, and this is not met with a lot of favor. And so his life is going to be in danger. So he and his followers are going to flee to a city about 200 miles north called Medina. This journey is called the Hijra, or the flight, or departure. And this will mark year one of the Islamic calendar. This is how they reckon time, beginning their timeline with the flight to Medina from Mecca in 622 AD. So we say it's 622 AD, but according to Islam, that's year one. Now, from here, his following is going to actually grow very rapidly. He's going to find a audience just ready to listen and to turn to his ideas. And he will return back to Mecca just a little bit later, conquering. This will be a military conquest of Mecca, and he will conquer those who oppose him, and he will destroy the idols in the Kaaba. Now, here's a picture of the Kaaba today as it stands. It's the black square structure in the center of this mosque, and this is, again, in modern-day Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Saudi Arabia, the Kaaba. And so this is a very important architectural a piece of architecture, a very important structure building in Islam. It is the holiest site in Islam. Now, talking about the authoritative text in Islam, as we said, there are several authoritative texts. The main one is the Quran. They will also have the Hadith, which are the teachings of Muhammad. And as we mentioned, the Bible itself is considered an authoritative text, but only so as long as it doesn't contradict the teachings in the Quran and the Hadith. Now, you will often hear people talk about in Islam the 5 pillars of Islam, the 5 main teachings, and we've sort of alluded to several of them, but let's look at these. The first is the Shahada, which is the belief in and recitation of this phrase, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. This is a very important tenet of or belief of the Islamic faith, that there is no God and Muhammad is his prophet. Another pillar of Islam is the Salat, which is prayer 5 times a day facing Mecca. You have to make sure no matter wherever you're at in the world, you have to turn and face Mecca. And you've probably seen in different movies or TV shows or documentaries, they have a prayer mat that they lay out, and they remove their shoes and they bow on the mat facing Mecca, and they worship that way and pray. The next tenet or pillar is the Sam, which is the fasting. There it is on the far left there on the chart, the Sam. And this is the fasting during daylight hours of Ramadan. There's no eating, no drinking, no smoking, no physical intimacy between married people or otherwise. And so during the daylight hours during Ramadan, which is a sacred Islamic month on the Islamic calendar, and so during the day, you don't eat, drink, or do any of these things. You don't do anything really enjoyable so that you can focus on becoming more, submitting more to Allah. Now, another tenet is the Hajj. And this is that hopefully during your lifetime, a Muslim will be able to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your lifetime, that you will go to the shrine or the mosque in Mecca. And then lastly, the zakat. And this is the purification by giving alms to the poor. So they take care of the poor by giving alms. It's called the zakat. And this is a 5th of the 5 pillars. Now, Islam does have many additional teachings that are similar to Judaism and Christianity. There are rules about moral conduct. They believe in the idea of a resurrection, a heaven, and a hell. So there are many similar teachings. However, there are many significant contradictory teachings as well, and very significant. And one of the primary ones is that they do not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They do not believe that he died on the cross on behalf of mankind in order to pay for our sin and bring forgiveness to all mankind who accepts Jesus by faith. They simply do not believe this. They do believe that Jesus was a real person. They do believe that he was a prophet. They believe that he performed miracles. They do not believe he was crucified, and he is not the Son of God. This is the teachings of Islam. They do not believe that you can be forgiven of your sin aside from essentially working. Islam is essentially salvation or attaining paradise is not because Allah loves you, but it is because you have done enough work that you might please Allah. And so really it is a works-based faith that you really, truly never know in this lifetime whether or not you've done enough to earn salvation. You just kind of hope that at the end you've done enough to merit the pleasure of Allah and you get to spend eternity in paradise. So this is significant differences in Christian teachings, and the two are simply not compatible. There are some similarities, as I said, in moral conduct, about sexual purity, about lying and stealing. These are all bad things. So there's some moral code conduct that is very similar. The idea of prayer is similar. The idea of worship is similar, but there are significant differences that the two simply are not compatible faiths. Now, going back to Muhammad, he will be essentially the political, military, and spiritual head of an Arabian state that will expand via military conquest, converting those they conquer. So he won't be just simply a prophet. He's not just doesn't have just a spiritual or religious or theological role. He will actually become the head of a military and political state, the state of an Arabian Islamic nation. Now, when Muhammad dies, he does not leave or name a successor. And as we've learned so far, that whether it was the Roman Empire or any other group, that when there is a void in leadership, there at the death of a strong king or emperor, there will become a conflict over the rightful succession of who's going to follow in the steps of the late or the dead ruler. And in this case, Muhammad's death is going to bring a great deal of conflict over who should lead the Islamic State. And essentially, this will create the two main Islamic factions that we have today, the Shia and the Sunni, which essentially stems from the conflict of who is the rightful leader of the Islamic State. Now, here you can see on the map the Arabian Peninsula. And so by the time of Muhammad's death, this is essentially the territory, 632 AD. This is the territory that is a part of the Islamic State. You can see the Byzantine Empire there. I didn't really shade them all in, but you know where the Byzantine Empire is. It's there at Constantinople and much of Asia Minor or the Anatolian Peninsula. The Sassanid or Persian Empire is basically Mesopotamia, Persia. And so all that's going on there. Of course, all the Franks, Vandals, all those guys, the Slavs are over there in Europe. But this kind of shows the relationship between the Islamic State in Arabia, the Byzantine Empire, and the Sassanid Persian Empire. Now, the first two leaders after the death of Muhammad are going to be called, and actually most of them afterwards are going to be called the caliphs. So the first two are Abu Bakr and Umar. And these were close family. The next, actually, four leaders will be the close family or followers of Muhammad. And they're going to be given the title Caliph, which means successor. Abu Bakr is going to rule for about 2 years. He's Muhammad's father-in-law. The next Caliph or leader will be Umar. He'll lead for about 10 years. The next one is Uthman, who rules for about another 12 years. And then ultimately Ali, who is Muhammad's son-in-law, will rule for about 5 years until 661 AD. These caliphs are going to expand Islam through military conquest throughout the Arabian Peninsula, but they're also going to move into the Palestinian Israel territory, north into Syria, and then west into Egypt. So here is the map. Now, just 30 years earlier in 632, Islam was just in the peninsula, but now after about 30 years, you can see that it has spread significantly across northeast Africa, up into the Middle East and into the Mesopotamian area. And so they've pushed back the Sassanid Persian Empire, they've conquered some of their territory, and they are now starting to infringe into Byzantine Empire territory as well. So this is going to put some pressure in the Byzantine world, and the Islamic Caliphates are something that they're going to have to deal with. Now, if you advance the calendar about another 90 years to 750 AD, this is what the map looks like. The Islamic State has pushed across North Africa. They've crossed over into Europe and basically most of Spain. they will actually push into Europe and be defeated by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. We'll look at that here in a couple of weeks. But Islam has spread west and across Africa into Europe. They've spread east, again, basically taking over the Persian Sassanid Empire, all of Mesopotamia and Persia. They are now dominating. So this is the world between 661 and 750 that the Islamic State has created for themselves. Now, this is a map of what the rest of Europe looks like. You can see, again, this is 750. You can see the Islamic State. You can see the Byzantine Empire. And then you can see the rest. We've talked about the Slavs, the Germans, the Frankish kingdom, which we're going to talk a lot about here in coming weeks. The Italian peninsula is basically divided up between the Byzantine Empire and the Lombards, which is another tribe. And of course, they're in Britannia or Britain. You can see the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. But this is how the Mediterranean world is sort of divided up. Now, notice north of the Black Sea is a group called the Turks. Keep an eye on them. They're going to be important in just a minute because they're going to take over the Islamic Caliphate. This caliphate is called the Abbasid Caliphate, and it's going to rule from 750 AD. But let's fast forward just a little bit. Boom, there we go. This is over the next, say, 300 years. And the Turks, which we just mentioned a minute ago, this is a specific tribe of the Turks called the Seljuk Turks, and they are going to have taken over much of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate, the Caliph will still be the leader, but only sort of in a puppet role, sort of dominated by the Seljuk Turks. And you can see the Byzantine Empire, which has decreased in its size, its territorial size. The Holy Roman Empire, which don't worry about that, we're going to get to that soon. And the Normans in southern Italy. So this is going to set up the conflict. The date here is 1096 AD. This is essentially where we're at when the Crusades will begin. So let's sort of unpack this. As I said, from the east comes the Seljuk Turks. That's a Central Asiatic Persian tribe. They're going to conquer much of Syria and the Holy Land and part of Anatolian Byzantine Empire. Let's see. The Seljuk Turks are going to manage to conquer and unify a portion of the Abbasid territories, and it is their control of the Holy Land here, which Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee region, the coastline of Palestine, Israel. It's their control of this territory that is going to bring about the Crusades. So let's go ahead and open up our study of the Crusades. Now, you may know a lot about the Crusades. You may know little. You probably know most of what you know from the movies. But the Crusades are essentially a series of military incursions conducted from about 1096 to 1272 AD. So it's about a 200-year time period. And these will be led by various popes, European kings, and nobility. There will be 8 major crusades and several minor ones. Now, here's what the goals of these crusades were, essentially. The goals were to regain control of and protect the sacred sites in the Holy Land. The churches like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus had been crucified and buried. It was the site of those events. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem that sort of marked the spot where Jesus had been born. There were all kinds of holy sites that had been taken over by the Islamic Caliphates. And in some cases, Christians were either not allowed to go there anymore, or they were heavily taxed in order to go there. And so the Crusades' goal was to recover these sites. Another goal, a stated goal, was to protect Christians who lived in the Holy Land, whose lives were in danger by the Islamic State. Thirdly, their goal was to protect Christian pilgrims. Christians from Europe who were traveling to and from the Holy Land often had unsafe passage through this territory into the Holy Land. So they wanted to guard the pilgrims. And finally, it was to protect the Byzantine Empire from incursions by the Islamic Caliphate. So the Byzantine Empire was being threatened, essentially. So these were some of the stated goals. Now, there were some other goals that are less altruistic or less positive, and unfortunately, it's as so often, war is about politics and about power and money and position. And it's really often not about just helping and protecting people, but often wars are about how can I make myself better, have a better country, a better territory, more money, more influence, and more power. Now, most of the Crusades, you need to know, were basically dismal failures, at least from a military or strategic standpoint. And you also need to know this: not all Crusades were against non-Christian or Islamic states. The Fourth Crusade specifically was actually Christians fighting Christians. They were attacking Constantinople, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But let's go back to the First Crusade. How did this all start? Well, the Byzantine emperor by the name of Alexius I Komnenos. He is the Byzantine emperor from 1057 to 1118, and he is going to fear, I should say those are actually his birth and death dates, not his reign dates, I believe. He's going to fear that Constantinople is going to fall to the advances of the Islamic Caliphate. So he's going to appeal to the Pope in Rome. It's Pope Urban II. And here's a picture of Pope Urban II. He's going to appeal to him for assistance. We need help. And Pope Urban is going to then, in turn, appeal to European Christian kings for aid and call for a crusade to capture, or I should say recapture, the Holy Land. You can see here these paintings. There's Pope Urban II, and he is asking for the people to rise up and crusade. Now, here is a picture of the First Crusade. And interestingly enough, the First Crusade was actually not the First Crusade. The First Crusade was before the one that we call the first one. The first one was actually undertaken by a poor mob. It was a mob of poor people, but they were enthusiastic European Christians intent on taking back the Holy Land for the Christians. So they essentially were aroused by a fanatical French priest by the name of Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit. And they're going to march through Germany committing, unfortunately, trying to get to the Holy Land. They're going to march through Germany committing atrocities against Jews before arriving in Byzantine territory. It's not the Kermit, it's the Hermit. Sorry, wrong thing here. Peter, it's not the crusading Kermit the Frog, it's Peter the Hermit. There we go. That's who we're looking at. And this is a picture of where's it at? There we go. This is often called the People's Crusade, which was led by Peter the Hermit. Oh, I didn't mean for that to go back. Let's see if we can't go back to there. Yeah, we got to go back through this. Hold on. First Crusade. There's the Kermit. Yeah, this is my attempt at humor. Just go with it. Not that guy. This guy. There we go. The Hermit. Very good. And here is a painting of him. See if it's going to automatically display if I have to advance it. Here we go. So this is ultimately called the People's Crusade in 1096 AD, led by Peter the Hermit. And so as I said, they're going to be sort of fanatically aroused by this fanatical French priest and just going to arouse their enthusiasm and their vigor for retaking the Holy Land. And these aren't soldiers. These are just everyday, ordinary people. It turns into a mob of poor people that are traveling across Europe through Germany to get to the Holy Land. And unfortunately, along the way, as I said, they commit horrible atrocities attacking Jews. Now, you have to understand, in this time period, Jews were being persecuted. Jews were not just, we often talk about World War II and the Holocaust, but unfortunately, Jews had been persecuted for centuries. And during this time period, there were many Christians who said, you know what, the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. So therefore, we're supposed to hate Jews. We're supposed to kill Jews. Unfortunately, that's a terrible, terrible thing. That was a terrible way of looking at things. It was a few religious leaders that basically got the people in Jerusalem, a few people, to call for Jesus' crucifixion. It was the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was the one that actually ordered him to be crucified. So the ordinary average Jew had nothing to do with the death of Jesus, but unfortunately, people can be stirred up to have terrible thoughts about other people. And so this is going to happen here. This is going to happen for centuries, but you see a horrible example of it here during the People's Crusade. Now, once they actually get to Byzantine territory and they cross over into Anatolia or Asia Minor, they're going to then cross into Islamic-controlled Anatolia, and they will quickly be ambushed and annihilated in October of 1096. So this, what we call the People's Crusade, did not amount to anything. Unfortunately, some very poor enthusiastic people were deceived and led to their deaths in 1096. Now, what we really call the First Crusade happened between 1096 and 1099 AD. This was undertaken not by a mob, but by some kings and some nobles. This will be called the the Prince's Crusade. This will be undertaken by professional soldiers, knights, and crusaders from France. I said kings a minute ago, but really wasn't led by kings so much as it was professional soldiers, knights, nobility from Europe, mainly from France, Italy, and Flanders. And they're going to take up the call to crusade, and they will arrive in Anatolia in the spring of 1097 AD. And they will be successful in the sense that they will, for a time, take Jerusalem. And that will happen in July 15 of 1099 AD. Now, this will take like 2 years. There will be setbacks and there will be victories. They will lay siege to Jerusalem for 5 weeks and eventually emerge victorious. Unfortunately, the Crusaders will mercilessly, ruthlessly massacre the inhabitants of Jerusalem, both Muslim and Jews. It's a horrible picture. A horrible picture. The optics, of course, are terrible on this. The fact that people would do this in the name of Jesus is unfortunate and contrary to the teachings of Jesus. Jerusalem, again, has been recovered, and it's going to set up centuries of conflict between Christians and Muslims and Jews, unfortunately. Now, after they've recovered Jerusalem, they're going to set up what's called the Crusader states. They're going to divide the territory into 4 major areas in Syria, Judea, and Cyprus. And these will basically be led by or ruled by European lords or knights who had come and conquered the Holy Land on behalf of Christians. And this is what the map looks like. So that yellow territory on the far right there, that's Syria, part of Syria, and Israel, Palestine, and then the island of Cyprus there in the Mediterranean. Those will be the Crusader states. Now, these states will have some great difficulty. As you can see, they're quite far away from Europe, quite far away from friendly faces. They're in the middle of the Seljuk Turkish Sultanate in the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate. And so it's going to be a lot of conflict and a lot of struggle. The Crusader states will basically struggle to keep the peace in the Holy Land. And it is the loss of Edessa. You can see the map there pointing out Edessa at the top part of the yellow section. It's that specific state that is going to bring the Second Crusade. They're trying to recover this territory, and it will be disastrous. The Crusaders will meet with horrific defeat. Now, how does Jerusalem get back in the hands of Islam and the Caliphate? Well, it is the brilliant leader Saladin, who is alive from 1138 to 1193. He is the greatest of the Muslim sultans. He is going to retake Jerusalem after the famous Battle of Hattin. So let's look at a couple of graphics here. Here is the Battle of Hattin. Saladin was a brilliant tactician, and he's going to lure the king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, away from the well-watered and well-fortified city of Jerusalem. Remember, the Crusaders have control of Jerusalem, but Saladin is going to come with his armies up into the Galilee region, just to the west of the Sea of Galilee. And he's going to lure Guy's army, the Crusader army, away from Jerusalem, and the Crusader army is going to be massacred. And it happens at a famous site called the Battle of Hattin. And it is here that the armies basically just get devastated. And when the armies have been lured out and devastated and massacred, leaves Jerusalem wide open for the Islamic State to take over and eventually the collapse of the Crusader states. Here is a picture of the site of the Battle of Hattin here in Israel. This happens on July 4, 1187 AD, and this is where they will be defeated. Now, Guy de Lizon will be captured. He will surrender, and he will basically have to turn Jerusalem over to the Islamic State, to Salah ad-Din. Now, eventually, because Jerusalem is lost, this will eventually bring on the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem. It will ultimately fail. You may actually know some of the players in this. This is called the King's Crusade. You may recognize some of the names here. How about this one? Is it going to come on its own? There it is. There's going to be Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, but how about Richard the Lionhearted of England? You probably recognize that name. So Richard I, the King of England, is going to help, along with these other kings, undertake the Third Crusade. It will happen over the course of 3 years, and they will not be successful. They are going to recapture Acre and Jaffa, which are important port cities on the Palestinian coast, but they will fail to retake Jerusalem. And if you're familiar with the Robin Hood stories, that's happening during this time period. It's that John, who's the brother of King Richard, along with the Sheriff of Nottingham, are going to plot to dethrone Richard in his absence. So this is happening at the same time. At least those stories are happening at the same time. Now, we've taken us through the Third Crusade. How about the Fourth? And we're not going to look at all 8 of them, but you need to know these three or 4. This is the sack of Constantinople by Christian knights. So mind you, Constantinople is the headquarters or the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And it is during the Fourth Crusade, which begins in 1204 AD, that they're going to basically lay siege to Constantinople. And once they breach the incredible fortifications that they have, they're going to slaughter and devastate and sack the city. This is basically a political squabble between European powers who are going to use religion as a weapon to facilitate political change. They want to put a new emperor on the throne in Constantinople. They want one that's friendly to their goals and their politics. And to make that happen, they're going to lay siege to and attack. These is going to happen Western Christian knights and crusaders. And this is going to happen in April 12 through 13 of 1204 AD. Now, Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, will never fully recover from this devastation. After the sacking of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire will be in a constant state of decline. And eventually a new Muslim dynasty called the Ottoman Turks. We talked about the Seljuk Turks, who are currently in control. Well, they will be overcome by a new Turkish tribe called the Ottomans. And they will essentially become the Ottoman Empire. And they will be the ones that finally control and defeat the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. And of course, we talked about this date already in 1453, that this will happen, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. So this is what the world looks like. The Mediterranean world looks like during the Ottoman Caliphate between 1300 and 1924. Look at that. 600 years taking us up into the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Caliphate. North Africa, Egypt, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, parts of the Middle East, the Anatolian Peninsula, and much of what had been the Byzantine Empire in Southeast Europe is all going to be part of the Ottoman Caliphate. The Ottoman Empire will actually play a part in the First World War, and we'll talk about that next spring. So this is important to know. With the possession of the Dardanelles, remember that's the crossing between the Anatolia Peninsula and Europe. It's a very important crossroads. The Ottomans now are going to hold a monopoly on major trade routes, part of which is the Silk Road, which we'll talk more about next chapter. But these are the trade routes between the Middle East and Europe and Asia. And they have no intention of sharing this with the rest of the world. They're going to essentially close the Silk Road. And this is very important because with no direct route to the East and the Far East, this is going to be the impetus for exploring around Africa and eventually exploring west which is going to be the finding of the New World. So this is a significant historical event that is going to have significant repercussions, and eventually the New World is discovered with Christopher Columbus and other explorers moving west to try to find a way to get to the east without going through the Ottoman Empire. So this is a pretty significant event here, the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and the loss of Constantinople, the closing of the Silk Road. Okay, as we wrap this up, what is the legacies of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine civilization, and the Islamic civilization? Let's take a look first at the Byzantine civilization and its legacy. First, the Byzantine Empire is going to preserve and transmit the classical heritage of the Greek and Roman empires. Their laws, their culture, their political structures, their architecture, their art, their philosophy, their technology. The Byzantine Empire is going to be the continuation of the Roman Empire and basically bring that into the medieval world. And so this is a very important contribution of the Byzantine Empire. It's also going to be a buffer between Europe and the ever-expanding Islamic armies. If the Byzantine Empire hadn't been there, it is quite possible that the incursions of the Islamic armies into Europe would have gone much further, much quicker. And then next, they transmitted Greek culture, the political and religious culture, to Eastern European peoples. We've already discussed earlier in this chapter how they had great impact with the Slavic people groups. We talked about two Eastern Orthodox missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, who will take Christianity to the Slavs in Eastern Europe and Russia, and Cyril and Methodius will create the Cyrillic alphabet. So it's this bridging of the Byzantine culture with the Slavic culture that will have significant and long-term impact on Eastern European peoples. Another significant contribution is Byzantine art. Byzantine art is renowned throughout the world for its beauty, vivid colors. Let's look at a few examples. Here are several examples of Byzantine wall paintings. And you just see in different Byzantine or Orthodox churches the brilliant colors of their icons, their wall paintings. It's absolutely significant. Here's another wall painting at the top of an arch, a dome within a church. Here's some more. This is just beautiful paintings. We could just go on and on. Sometime I encourage you, visit an Orthodox church and just see their beauty of their art and the spiritual beauty of all their art. And here's another contribution: Byzantine illuminated manuscripts. They used art in theological works, in Bibles and in different manuscripts. And it's brilliant. They used gold leaf. They used incredible colors and drawings. It's quite remarkable. Here's another example of an illuminated manuscript here. Now, another contribution in art is the Byzantine mosaics, the use of tiles, or in Latin, tesserae, plural, to create these phenomenal pictures of biblical characters, of saints, of different scenes from the Bible. The mosaics are absolutely brilliant. Now, their artwork contributions were not just relegated to art itself, but they had brilliant metalwork. You can see this beautiful chalice, this beautiful gold work. Architecture, another significant contribution. And as we already mentioned, the Church of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, it is still deemed an architectural marvel 1,500 years after it's been constructed. Putting a dome on top of a rectangle or square was absolutely phenomenal. How does one do that? I encourage you to look up other videos or other information about this engineering marvel that it is. But Byzantine architecture was significant. Now, I want to make sure I've mentioned this here, and I thought that I had a slide for it, and maybe it's coming up still, but in case it's not there, I want you to understand how significant the Byzantine contributions were to preserving Roman history, Roman culture, Roman and Greek philosophy, all of that stuff. And I think we actually did talk about it a minute ago, but I don't want to underestimate how significant the Byzantine contributions were to the world. Now, let's look finally at Islamic legacies. Now, we can look at all kinds of wonderful things that are fun to look at. Beautiful Islamic textiles, silk, muslin, which is fine cotton, linen, damask, which is cloth with silver and gold thread interwoven to it, ornamental carpets, finely tooled leather, filigree jewelry, engraved silver and gold, exquisite knives and swords, incredible produce like dates and oranges and apricots, lemons, peaches, melons, things that Europeans had never seen before, is going to be a significant contribution from the Islamic world. European crusaders are going to have come in contact with some of these beautiful forms of art, beautiful clothing, foods and spices that they've never tasted before. You can see these wonderful spice pyramids in Jerusalem and in different markets like Syria and Damascus, but you can see this guy is famous for his spice pyramids there in the old city of Jerusalem. But the Crusaders had never tasted some of these things, and they're going to take this stuff back with them to Europe, and Europeans are going to want more of this, which is going to increase trade between Europe and the Middle East. As I said before, tooled leather, the ability to work leather into significant artwork and useful forms. Here you have a pilgrim flask, which essentially is a canteen. You can see this beautiful case for carrying and storing a Quran. These were beautiful pieces of leather work. Islam was known for its ability to create amazing swords and scabbards and knives and daggers. They were also known for their jewelry. Here you see a filigree ring, quite exquisite, but they were known for their metal work. Now, here's what's going to happen with all of this. Crusader ships are going to return, as I mentioned a minute ago, with all of these luxuries. And this is all new to these European states, and they're going to greatly desire more. The kings, the queens, the nobility, they want more of this beautiful fabrics and textiles. They want these beautiful carpets. They want these fruits and these spices and this gold and silver. It's quite exquisite. And so this will lay the groundwork for what we call the Age of Discovery, as European nations are going to try to find routes, better routes, quicker routes to the Middle East and eventually the Far East, which will, again, try to bypass the Islamic-controlled Middle East. But it's going to be the connection between the European nations and the Islamic Caliphates that is going to create this desire for more goods from the Middle East and eventually the Far East. Now, is that all the Islamic Caliphates contributed? Oh, by far. They contributed so much more. Abu al-Zawahiri is going to be a significant contributor of medicine. They are going to learn from classical Greek physicians like Hippocrates. They're going to put into practice many of the ideas of the Greeks and the Romans, the idea of clean hospitals and clean patients, surgical skills, pharmacies, the inspection of medicines. These are all going to be significant ideas that the Islamic world will either create or develop more that they've picked up from the Greeks. You can see these artwork showing various doctors undergoing or giving different medical tests. Here is a painting of a surgery taking place. So this is significant. They're going to have significant surgical and medical tools they're going to develop. You can see this is an actual surgeon's toolkit here, and drawing a textbook of these tools and how to use them and when to use them. You're also going to have mathematics. The Islamic world is going to champion mathematics. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, I can't say his name very well, I apologize. Khwarizmi. Oh my goodness, I just butchered that, I apologize. But significant Islamic work in mathematics. They're going to learn from Indian mathematicians for the subcontinent of India, and they're going to improve upon and popularize, among other things, but they're going to popularize the ideas of zero, algebra, etc. They're going to do significant work in advancing mathematics. How about literature? Oh, well, goodness. If you love Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, then this is the heart of the work of Omar Khayyam, who is an Islamic writer, author. The Arabian Nights, this is all part of his work. So if you like Aladdin, well, you can thank Omar Khayyam, who is an Islamic author. Islamic art and architecture is going to be significantly contribute significantly to the world's art. Here we have an example of Islamic calligraphy. Art was a form of worship for Islam. Muhammad forbid art that represented humans and animals, considered that it's a possibility of moving into idolatry. So consequently, artists developed a highly ornamental geometric artistry that decorated their buildings, mosques, etc. And their calligraphy became an important artistic style. So here you can see in this little niche, the Islamic calligraphy. That's not just squiggles, that's Islamic Arabic text, script. And these are all verses, generally verses from the Quran. You can see on the side of this building here at the top, I don't know if you can make that out, but that is Islamic Arabic script. You can see it here on the right side as well. Now, the other contribution that Islam is going to have is the preservation of classical texts and ideas. Just as the Romans borrowed from the Greeks and the Etruscans and improved upon them, and they preserved their ideas, the Byzantines will do the same thing. Well, guess what? The Islamic Caliphates will also preserve Greek and Roman and others, Mesopotamian and Persian and Indian texts and ideas. As they come in contact or conquer other lands, they're going to translate their own texts, these new lands, into Arabic. And they will build a vast library of ideas, philosophies, knowledge from the Greek and Roman world, India, China, Egypt, Syria. Many of these works and their knowledge or ideas would have been lost to the modern world if they had not been preserved by Muslim scholars. This is a significant contribution of the Islamic world. Muslim philosophy is going to be a significant contribution. The Islamist theologian and jurist Al-Ghazali, I have a hard time saying his name too, Al-Ghazali is going to be a significant developer of the cosmological argument for God's existence. This was first created and thought of by Christian philosophers in the 5th and 6th century, but it will come to its fullest development under Al-Ghazali, and we'll talk more about that in our apologetics class next year as juniors. And as I already mentioned, they will preserve the rich treasury of Greek and Roman literature, preserving texts and libraries, ensuring their survival for centuries to come. Now, art and architecture, we're almost done, so stay with me here. Mosques were the most important and notable Islamic architecture. The dome and the minaret, which is the tower for calling Muslims to prayer, and the courtyard are the main features of the mosque. Inside the buildings, they will be decorated with quotes from the Quran in an Islamic calligraphic style. A niche will mark the direction of Mecca, to which they are to face in their daily prayers. Here's one of the most famous mosques. This is called the Dome of the Rock. This is in Jerusalem. It sits on top of the Jewish Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. And it is the third holiest site in Islam. The first is in Mecca, the second in Medina. Now here's a drawing of different Islamic architectural features. You can see the dome, you can see the dome there, but you can see the minaret, which is where they will have the call to prayer. You'll see the courtyard, the women's area. There will be a place for women and for men separate, the place where they do their prayers. There's the pulpit called the minbar, where the imam usually gives his sermon or preaches. So this is different parts of the Islamic mosque. Now, one of the most famous mosques as well, as we already mentioned, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Actually, we didn't really mention that one, but that's near the Dome of the Rock, there at the Temple Mount. This is the Hagia Sophia, which was a church, but when they captured Constantinople, they converted it to a mosque. They did not destroy it because they realized it was such a beautiful piece of architecture. And they've changed it a little bit. They've obviously put these minarets there. Were not there before. They made some other changes. But at the heart of this structure is still there. This is in modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. Used to be Constantinople. Now it's called Istanbul. And here's a picture of the Hagia Sophia Mosque as it stands today. So these are the significant legacies of the Islamic civilization. And I guess probably the last one I'll just say, those words flew by very quickly, is the merging of cultures. One of their greatest achievements of the Islamic Empire was their ability to borrow, adapt, and embrace ideas and technology and add them to their own unique ideas and technology. This made the Muslim world incredibly successful, wealthy, and powerful. And during this era, it was a golden age for Islam. As the Muslim Empire expanded east, they came into contact, as I said before, with India, China, the Far East civilizations, and they were able to conduct trade and diplomacy with these people, acquiring great knowledge, wealth, and they will connect Europe with the Far East. As the European world had greater contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades, the Islamic world will become a bridge between Europe and the Far East. And Crusaders, as I said, will be amazed at the opulence of the Islamic world. So this is our study of the Byzantine world and civilization and the Islamic civilization. We'll discuss more of this in class.